And we're live. Welcome, ladies, gentlemen, extraterrestrials, and hobbits, to our next episode of Scuttlebutt with the Phill, where we discuss science fiction, fantasy, and horror. I'm here to say a few things, do a few things, and leave a little something on myself to the infamy of the internet. I am your host, Philip A. Leavenworth, coming at you live from San Diego State University's Digital Humanities in the library here at San Diego State. I'm a writer and producer originally from Los Angeles, California, currently living in San Diego, while I return to grad school to pursue a MFA in creative writing and learn how to become a college professor by day and a filmmaker slash novelist at night. In this episode, we will be discussing the topic of the works of Stephen King. And joining me is my friend and fellow MFA cohort member, Benjamin Frandsen. Ben, would you like to introduce yourself for the kind folks at home?
Sure. My name is Benjamin, and he has called us friends, which is cool. But technically, he just met me outside on the sidewalk begging for change a few minutes ago. So I don't know. We are in the Master of Fine Arts for Creative Writing program here at SDSU. He is working on his sci-fi while I'm working on a memoir and a crime fiction novel.
And yeah, tell the audience a little bit of what you're up to. Also,
Generally, well, I have a weird trajectory, I guess you could say. I spent 18 years in prison for a murder I did not commit. The state finally ironed out what happened about 2.5 years ago. I applied for and was accepted at UCLA while I was still inside. And so I went right to UCLA, just graduated from UCLA in June. And I came here in the summer with no break. In fact, there was a month where I was going to both schools at once. So it was a bit intense, but I'm happy to say things have cooled down a little bit just for the school part. However, like you, I am also teaching 3 freshman classes, which basically amount to College 101 for Dummies. First year seminar class, How to Be a College Student 101. And I'm also the executive director of a nonprofit called the Ben Free Project. If you want to check that out, you can look up benfreeproject.org. And as Phill is well aware, we just applied for 5 arts-based contracts to provide arts programming inside of California prisons. And Phil's was, unsurprisingly, for a curriculum for sci-fi. We also did comic creation and another hip-hop and poetry and creative writing trauma-based program called Bars Behind Bars, Hope and Mike Creative Writing Performance Therapy.
I think that, as you mentioned, we have been getting along quite well here, despite having just met you on the street not long ago. But in all seriousness, I'll be adding a lot of the details for the Ben Free Project in the description for those of you who are tuning in after this is aired already. And you'll be seeing more of Ben, I'm sure, in the coming months and hopefully years ahead. The program is a 3-year-long program, so we're at the start of it. But hopefully, it's the start of a more longer and enduring friendship. But as we move on to our main subject, the works of Stephen King, I guess we'll start with my sort of introduction to it, and then kind of expand on it from there. I mean, Stephen King, I think, has always been some kind of a fixture in my life. His work has always been something I've wanted to aspire to, at least just in terms of like a vibe or atmosphere.
Sure.
I mean, horror-wise, one of the first things I was introduced to was the Langoliers when I was a kid. I think some people laugh at it now, but no, I thought it was legitimately terrifying when I first saw it. And then I discovered there was other, horror things that he had done that were a little bit more intense, like The Mist. That was a movie he did, or that was a movie they adapted, I think, in the 2000s. And that one has a different type of ending than the book does. And so I think even Stephen King himself said that, that's a really messed up ending, because it's like in that story, the main characters find their way out, but at a great cost. And so we'll kind of elaborate on that
Have you
a little bit
read
later.
his book on writing?
Yes. Actually, there's a funny story about how I acquired that book. So somebody, I think, was trying to be a writer too at my old job at the LA Times, and they had left the book
Wait,
up.
someone at the LA Times was trying to be a writer?
Well,
That is phenomenal. This sounds like science fiction.
yeah, exactly. No, but no, at my job, at least at the time, I was still working out on the floor, so I was handling forklift stuff and palletizer work. So it was more of the menial labor tasks. But yeah, this poor fool left a copy of the book up on the control console of the palletizer, and I was like, "Huh, well, nobody's using this thing. I might as well take it." And I took it, and it's been mine ever since. It's been, I think, pretty valuable in
Yeah, for
my
sure.
approach to writing.
He has a collection of first lines of books.
Yeah.
His favorite first lines. I found that out because I was reading an entirely different book by Michael Connolly called The Poet.
Yeah.
And the first line of that is, "Death is my beat."
Yeah.
And he commented on that as being one of his all-time favorite first lines.
Yeah.
I came across Stephen King because, well, I read one of his books. I think it was, what's the one with the monkey and the symbols on the front? A book of short stories.
The name escapes me for some reason.
But the individual story I'm talking about was called Survival Type.
Yeah.
And it was this weird irony. This guy who was just the epitome of hubris, just a real schmuck, a doctor who was dirty in the conniving kind of sense.
Yeah.
And there was a shipwreck, and there was one escape boat, and he and one other guy got on, and as the other guy was untying the thing and whatever, he shoved the guy off, and the guy died. So he gets in the boat by himself, and he grabs all the stuff. Now, what no one knew is that he was there because he had this huge shipment of medical grade heroin with him. And so he gets in this little life raft. There's a big storm, and he washes up finally on shore by himself. And he gets there and realizes that he has no food and millions of dollars worth of heroin in a little boat.
Yeah.
It's just about him. And he's looking at this kind of gorgeous island. And at first he thinks it's okay. And he realizes there are no creatures here. There's no meat. There's nothing to eat.
Yeah.
And so he just proceeds to break his foot and then have to amputate it. And he's been starving, and he's amputates his own foot using the heroin. And the narrative goes in and out of being almost totally unintelligible from him being completely high out of his mind. And at one point, that part of the narrative says, all I could think of was cold roast beef.
Yeah.
And then you realize, oh, he's eating his foot. Like, this is a twisted dude.
Yeah. I mean, I think there was an anecdote somebody had mentioned where they met Stephen King, and they were like hoping he'd be kind of like kind of weird and kind of like, I don't know, eccentric. And I guess they were just off put by how like normal he was.
Right.
Like they were like,
how dare he be normal?
Yeah, he doesn't seem like this. And it's like, well, just because he's he writes this stuff doesn't mean he has to live it. So, I mean,
a woman in an interview asked him, what do you tell people when they ask you how you can write such horrible things?
Yeah.
And he said, well, I tell them I have the heart of a little boy. She said, really? He said, yeah, I keep it in a jar on my desk.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. But yeah, I think even beyond that, I think some of his best stories have not been horror. I mean, I brought up
Green Mile,
The Shawshank Redemption,
The Body,
that too.
/ Stand By Me.
Yeah, Stand By Me is another. I mean, I think that's always the mark of a good writer, where you can kind of have versatility, and where you can kind of shift between different genres. I guess I would assume, yeah, The Green Mile is probably the one that's the most of the three, the most supernaturally charged, because you have the elements that some people find problematic with with John Coffey, and the capacity to sort of be this healer. But then you have Stand By Me, and then you have these things are a little more normal, kind of more down to earth, and so you kind of have to wonder what the sort of supernatural element is in those stories, and there really isn't any.
Right.
They're just kind of just really well told stories, and it's kind of that thing that has always fascinated me about having that kind of versatility that I would want in my own writing.
I think the supernatural thing is not about the story, it's about the guy writing the story. Because when I read that whole book, Skeleton Crew, that was what it was called, and it was a book of short stories.
Mhm.
And I actually had a lot of other stuff to do. I was in high school at the time.
Yeah.
I didn't want to read it, and I actually couldn't put it down. Like drug addict, unable to set down the needle kind of thing.
Yeah.
I wasn't even totally enjoying it, but I was enthralled and I couldn't stop reading it. It kind of reminded me of one of those like Robert Johnson at the Crossroads, just sold his soul to play so good. I actually wondered about that at one point, like, wow, how did this guy get to write so addictively? And then I found out that there's a whole set of theories about that.
Yeah.
That he actually did exactly that. He's from Maine.
Yeah.
Which has got to be the weirdest state in the country. Lived in Boston for a while. And if someone is born in, say, Las Vegas, but they move to Maine when they're 1 year old,
yeah,
and then at the age of 55, they commit some heinous crime, everyone will say, oh, well, that figures he's from away. Anywhere that's not Maine is away.
Yeah.
Like that, there's Maine and then the whole rest of the universe.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, a lot of his writing is sort of like that. I mean,
misery.
Yeah. I mean, you have basically, I think 95% of his stories are not, that is not a scientifically tested number. I'm just throwing it out there. Most of his stories are set in either Derry, Maine, or they're set in someplace around Castle Rock, or that's kind of the sort of, I don't know what you want to call it, his shared universe that he has. And that usually ends up manifesting as a lot of interesting little adventures, we can put it, which kind of reminds me of, I don't know how familiar you are with the work of H.P. Lovecraft, but
oh yeah,
he's sort of got this, similar aspect to him that H.P. Lovecraft had, where basically H.P. Lovecraft stories were all set in and around Miskatonic University, and that's supposed to, I think, be in like Massachusetts.
It is.
So that was like his wheelhouse, and then Stephen King was able to just kind of corner Maine and make Maine his own little like headquarters for his stories. And so I would like to have something like that, but I don't know if I ever will. But you never know. Even beyond that, what would you say is the story that you think is, I wouldn't say his best story, but what's the one that you think you constantly return to?
Well, it depends. Like there's different kinds of scary, right?
Yeah.
The one I thought oddly was the scariest for me was Christine.
Okay.
There was something weirdly creepy about an evil car.
Yeah.
Because we see cars all the time. So you take a normal thing that we take for granted as just being our tool,
yeah,
and take our power over it away, and it suddenly becomes a much scarier thing.
Yeah.
And it was scarier that way than it was like in Maximum Overdrive or whatever, when everything was just all the machines were taking over like Terminator style. But that was an individual car that with a relationship with an individual guy, and also pretty well done in the movies too.
Yeah.
Those guys try to break in to mess with the car.
Yeah.
And the radio comes on. You keep on knocking, but you can't come in.
Yeah.
I was like, ooh.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, pretty much. Surprisingly, I think the story that I keep returning to the most is a more recent addition to his body of work. It's something called 11/22/63. And for those of you who are unaware, that is the novel where he explores an alternate timeline where JFK has, obviously been assassinated, but there's this guy Jeff Epping, played by James Franco in the little television show they had on Hulu a few years back. He has to go and pop into this like diner that has like a hidden closet or something, but there's like a portal in the closet. So once you walk through this portal, you end up in 1960.
Oh wow.
And so basically one of his friends who was the owner of this diner comes back in time from the sort of portal to the past, and like for him 3 years have passed, and he says that he has concocted this entire scheme to ensure that Lee Harvey Oswald gets taken out so that he can ensure JFK, lives on. And, because in his mind, he thinks that JFK being assassinated is what led to the timeline we have now, which is like not ideal or optimal. And so in his mind, he thinks that if you go back, you save JFK, you basically save the world. And so for some reason, that's been like scratching at my head for years, and kind of, it's not what made me fall in love with alternate history, but it's something that solidifies my interest in it. So, yeah, the guy goes back in time. He does save JFK, and he hops back through the portal, and he says, okay, the mission's over. But when he pops out through the portal, he basically sees that basically the world's a post-apocalyptic nuclear wasteland. So it's like, what? I went back in time and I tried to stop all this. And apparently what happened was it led to unintended consequences, which were that, yeah, he would have 2 terms, but then the people who come afterwards didn't have the best intentions or the best knowledge on how to like weather a nuclear war. And so ultimately that's what ended up happening. And I think even Stephen King kind of went over and said that in his exploration of the concept, he wanted to explore what's the worst case scenario for going back in time and saving JFK, what would happen? And obviously that's sort of the premise of the book. But I don't know, have you checked that one out?
Yeah. It got me thinking a lot too, because I used to think that the whole Illuminati thing was nothing more than conspiracy theory. But then I started reading some of the things based on the money behind who decided what happened to Kennedy.
Mhm.
And I liked the thing I read was pretty cool because it didn't interpret, it just gave a timeline.
Yeah.
And it gave a date that people from the Federal Reserve Bank met with John F. Kennedy and said that they wanted him to adopt as the currency for the nation the new Federal Reserve note, and that the previous money that said silver certificate, and which had been following the Constitution's all money shall be redeemable for gold and silver coin, and change it to Federal Reserve note, piece of paper drawn on a bank. And Kennedy listened to them and said, this isn't federal. I don't know how you're calling that. This is a private bank.
Yep.
It's Rothschilds and Vanderbilts and the kind of old money coalition. And you're saying you want to rent the currency to me to run the country at 1,000% interest, it looks like.
Yeah.
I'm not doing that. That's ridiculous. Yeah. And they basically told him to kind of change with the times and get with the program. And he said he wasn't doing that. And then the next bullet point was that Kennedy was assassinated 10 days later.
Emphasis on bullet point.
Yes. And
but
yes, good point. Touche.
Yeah.
But so when that happened, then that same day, somewhere way in the back page of the paper, they quietly announced that the bill was passed for the Federal Reserve to be signed off, and nobody noticed because Kennedy was all over the paper.
Yeah.
And ever since then, our money is prima facie worthless.
Well, I mean, even beyond that, I mean, it wasn't after JFK got assassinated, but you have LBJ that becomes president in our timeline. And then we have Nixon, who I believe takes us off the gold standard. So we end up in the situation that we're in. But, this is a Stephen King podcast, not a podcast about our feelings on monetary policy, but I'm sure that'll be coming at some point. I do want to do a whole episode about conspiracy theories and sort of kind of expanding on that probably next year at some point. But I don't know if you would be interested in something like that. But
conspiracy theories, of course.
Yeah. I mean, there's no shortage of them now. So
it also seems like oftentimes when somebody announces something as a conspiracy theory, it sounds crazy at first and then gets announced as, what's the common mainstream media phrase? Long ago debunked conspiracy theory.
Well,
and then later on, it's like, that's already been debunked. That's already been debunked. And then things come to light that almost exactly what the conspiracy theory was is true and becomes regular fodder for the news cycle.
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on what exactly it would be. But for me, I've seen, especially on the whatever media circuit we have on Twitter, where there is like blatant conspiracy theories, but also just plain like bullshit that gets passed off as fact. And because people repeat this like whatever line endlessly, it becomes fact. And so that's sort of terrifying, but also you have stuff on Twitter where people are, basically imagining these things into existence and sort of,
Huh.
basically creating controversy. I mean, obviously the social media apps are designed for maximum outrage.
Sure.
So these can drive up the algorithm and get the kind of testy conversations going. And so we end up having these sort of political back and forth between like, the left says this, the right says this, and obviously it's all kind of being fed into the same thing, which is, you know, both sides are being controlled by somebody, and ultimately, people who say they're not being controlled are probably the ones being controlled the most, and so that's the thing.
And it seems like they give each person some extreme viewpoint that makes it easy to dismiss everything else they say.
Yeah.
But that happens on both sides. Like the right was saying COVID's a hoax, and the left was having people wear masks when they were outside by themselves in a giant field. So it was like both these things were so extreme and so far from what was really going on that it's like it made everybody seem like a reactionary sci-fi nut job, right? The stuff that we just watched, like if you would have shown videos of the last few years to us 10 years ago, it would have looked like absolutely insane sci-fi, but it was just COVID era America,
Yeah. I mean, a lot of what I've been seeing, especially on the old Twitter, is people calling me out when I try to call them out. And I call out people on the left, I call out people on the right. I'm an equal opportunity offender in that way.
Good.
For me, it's like if the right is calling me a crazy communist and then the left is calling me a crazy Nazi, I have to be doing something right somewhere in the middle.
That's what I was going to say.
Yes. At least that's the hope. But, because you can't be both, at least as far as I'm aware. They're diametrically opposed ideologies. So I'd be surprised if you could blend them together. But I think that brings me to my next story I wanted to discuss, which was The Dead Zone. I don't know if you've read that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. That one's another one I've enjoyed. That one has that one was adapted into a TV show back, I think, in the wasn't the 90s, it was like the early 2000s. And in it you have the name escapes me now, but his name is because he works his way up through the ladder of politics, but eventually he becomes president. Greg Stilson. And he basically is this mad, Christian, like far right Christian nutbag. And he basically has this goal of thinking of himself as like the one who's about to change the world, and either for the better or for the worse. But in the movie of The Dead Zone, the main character is played by Christopher Walken.
I love Christopher Walken.
Yeah, he's the best. And then Greg Stilson is played by Martin Sheen. And so there's a scene where he glimpses the future. And because basically what he does is he has to shake other people's hands or just get into like contact with them, and he can kind of glimpse sort of like the near future, or sort of like the further out distant future. And so he envisions, when he bumps into this guy, of this person becoming president and then basically leading us down to nuclear apocalypse. And there's always this recurring theme with him about nuclear war. That kind of surprises me a little bit, but I think I brought this point up in one of our classes that I think nuclear war is sort of an old hat concern at this point. I mean, you do have constant stuff with Russia these days, and even concerns about China and North Korea, but
God,
I think ultimately we're in a situation that's probably the best situation we could have ever had, which is, we've had, to the development of the bomb, we've had 80 years of uninterrupted, mostly global peace. Like no other countries have tried to fight each other with nukes. It's always been like a deterrent, and it's pretty much worked. And I think the thing I'm describing is something called, I think it's actually called nuclear deterrence. And ideally, we can stay there, and it doesn't lead to anything, more dire. But what are your thoughts on the Dead Zone?
Well, I wonder about that whole, like, is it really a deterrent? Like, and also, the way it presented things about, the stockpiles of weapons and things that we have.
Hmm.
Like, how many times can we blow up the earth at this point? And if we're still stockpiling weapons, like, what are we trying to do? Like, if we even way, way, way early on, like even a little before the book was written, we could blow up the earth 8 to 10 times.
Yeah.
And now, who knows? It's like thousands of times we could blow up the earth with the amount of weapons that are there. But I like the idea of having everything be all segmented and, into actual literal territories of.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's like, we have this kind of concept where, you have all these nukes all over the world that have given us this period of peace, but there's still the uncertain specter that it could always happen again. And I guess there's a valid concern in that, but I think even beyond that, there's this discussion, we were having earlier with sort of the way speech has been going and what that could lead to. And all it takes is a demagogue or somebody to gain enough power and enough influence that it changes the outcome of anything. And today, things are so muddled that who the demagogue is becoming unclear to some. And so,
yeah, that happens to a lot of people because a lot of the rights seem to be being pushed away by one side recently. But then when everyone had to buy masks and testing kits, come to find out that something like 24% of the ownership for the largest company that manufactured COVID tests and masks was owned by people in Congress. It's like, and so they're having this big, huge debate. And you found out, I saw this little kind of an expose documentary thing where they were showing two people that were arguing on opposite sides of the aisle about masks and whatever, but it turns out they both owned this huge chunk of the company that was responsible for the mask. So of course, what you're thinking, okay, well, everybody needs mask, everybody needs test kit, that seemed to make sense at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But then isn't it kind of weird that the people that are arguing it own the company that's making the mask and the test? Like, what is?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this stuff is going to become very, very apparent very soon, since we're already kind of 4 years out from the pandemic, and eventually we'll be 10 years down the road, and then we'll kind of have a full view, hopefully, of what actually happened. I mean, I don't think information gets as suppressed as people think it does. The internet is forever, and I don't think anything that's been publicized is going to, if it has been tried, to be suppressed, I don't think it stays suppressed for very long anymore.
Yeah, I mean, longer than you would expect, I think sometimes, but not forever. Stuff still comes out.
Yeah.
But what I don't like is that feels very Orwellian to me and feels very kind of sci-fi, is that if you're in a certain area, you will only hear one version of a story.
Mm-hmm.
Like I took a class in summer at UCLA called "Forget Vaccines, Give Me Ivermectin."
Yeah.
A discussion on misinformation.
Yeah.
And so most of the class was about how to be open-minded and why you're doing yourself a disservice if you don't at least understand the other person's story. Because you can't just assume everybody else is a complete maniac or an idiot for thinking what they think.
Yep.
There's something underneath it. Like these are usually rational people that have heard something that convinced them of a fact, or at least of a purported fact.
Yeah.
So there were people in there who almost everyone but 3 people of like a 25-person class had actually never even heard an anti-vaccine argument.
Mm-hmm.
It was such a given and such a part of the fabric of their school and where they were and the makeup and their family and the California, I guess, mainstream, that they hadn't even heard of that. But on my first day, you get partnered with people to discuss things.
Mm-hmm.
I met someone from Arkansas, and she had never heard a pro-vaccine argument ever. Like not on the news, not anywhere. Like no, she didn't think that anyone seriously believed that. So it was really interesting to just see like what local media can do. Because if somebody comes out with a big story, but it's completely against the dominant paradigm, what everybody else is thinking, He might not even make the papers. Right?
I mean, I think a lot of that kind of speaks to the main problem we discovered when I was at the LA Times, which is, more and more local papers were starting to dry up. And so you ended up having these sort of arch conservative media platforms come to fill the void, especially in local broadcast news. There was this organization, Sinclair Media Group.
Right.
And they were constantly trying to just pepper news media with the same kind of, party line nonsense and then there was, I think, a video that came out where it was like 24 different local news outlets were kind of saying the same exact script because this company now owns them all. And so they're the key, they're the ones holding the keys to not only knowledge, but what the facts end up, coming out to the normal people. And so,
yeah, I saw an episode where this guy came out with his theory about something, and I guess he surprised the interviewers because his theory was that it had been a farce and the whole thing had been set up and that George Soros was behind it. So as soon as he mentioned George Soros's name, the interviewer stopped and said, hey, we don't need to talk about him. And then they cut to the other newscaster, looked terrified and said that I would agree with that. We don't need to talk about him. And they went to a commercial and they kicked the guy off the show. I was like, whoa, what just happened?
I haven't seen that quite yet, but I know that there's a lot of, especially on the one end of the media, sort of a knee-jerk reaction. Although I think it comes to the issue of Soros, it's a whole different can of worms. But we have to take a moment for ad time. So give me a moment to pay the bills, and we'll see. So I want to take a moment to thank our sponsor and owner, Vega Aerospace. Vega Aerospace. In space, no one can hear you. All right, back to the show. So, beyond that, what I'm surprised about, other than the Dead Zone, I don't think Stephen King has really touched on too much what it would be like to have like an actual dictatorship in the United States. I mean, he kind of had sort of a endpoint for Greg Stilson in the book, but he didn't really kind of dive into it at least as much as I think I would have if I was writing it. But there's a reason why he's Stephen King and I'm not. But we'll see what happens. Give me time. But beyond that, since it is horror month and horror month on the channel, this will be the last episode that we explore a concept or a theme from the horror genre, and the next week we'll be doing a little bit of a deep dive on a fictional work that I'm working on called Cherryfield. So please, stay tuned into that. For those in my audience that want to check that out, it'll be similar to how we did the introduction to From the Earth to the Stars, which I've already submitted to. I submitted a primer short story to the MFA program earlier this semester, so I think it's all going well on that front. But beyond that, I guess let's get more into some of the more scary elements of Mr. Stephen King.
Ooh.
Exactly.
Dun, dun,
So,
dun.
It. Have you read It?
Yes, and that was a problem in my family.
I bet.
My grandmother was a professional clown.
Oh, wow.
Her daughter, my mother, was always scared of clowns and was always embarrassed and worried about her hurting her mom's feelings.
Yeah.
So there were, like, in one restroom alone, one time I counted 70 like clown sculptures and framed things. And, my grandmother was one of those clowns that could make out of a balloon, could make like a giraffe. Here you go.
Yeah.
She did the birthday party thing and the cream pies and all that. So when this movie came out about a giant killer clown, I mean, my mom was just absolutely horrified.
Yeah.
And my grandmother didn't like it that they made the clowns look bad.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I didn't have that experience with it, but it's definitely fascinating. I think my first exposure to it was, I think, in middle school, and I decided to read it, and it took like a year, but it's a big door. A lot of his books are big ass door stoppers, so I think you can bludgeon someone to death with a lot of his books.
Yeah.
So it's
especially the original. They always had the different version, like they have the stand,
Yeah.
the one with the extra few hundred pages in it.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, with that, it's like reading through it as a kid was very weird in the sense that I think when we got about midway through, there's a sort of scene which I think Stephen King does not recall writing. I don't think he recalls writing much in the 80s. And I think there's a joke that somebody said that the co-writer of it was cocaine. But I don't know how true that is, but it's probably more true than not.
The co-writer of
Yeah.
it was cocaine.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah. Essentially, because there's a scene, I think, halfway through where the kids are basically running a train on one of the little girls. And it's like, only from the mind of Stephen King could that ever be remotely, I don't even think it was acceptable then, but it still is visceral and fascinating.
Well, it's been a part of a lot of literature with people don't really track it though.
Mm.
Been a part of a lot of psychology. You know, Freud was pretty involved. Did you ever read that? It wasn't by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, but it was a Sherlock Holmes book, The 7% Solution.
Yeah, I believe so.
That was what it was about, was cocaine.
Yeah.
And it starts right off with Sherlock pulled the hypodermic needle out of the neat Morocco case.
Yeah.
And he's pinching off his arm so he can get the vein out, and he's just puncturing his vein with the hypodermic needle right when Watson walks in and goes, "Holmes, good God, what are you doing?"
Yeah.
And he says, "My mind rebels at stagnation, Watson. Give me problems, give me work."
Yeah.
Because he just couldn't stop doing the drugs. I mean, there are so many. Cocaine is the co-pilot or the co-author of a lot of books, I think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's as Rick James once said, iconically, cocaine is a hell of a drug. But beyond that, I think there's a lot of Stephen King's early work where he publishes under a different name, Richard Bachman.
Right.
And there's a lot of those stories that I'm somewhat unfamiliar with. I mean, I'm familiar with them after the fact, but not initially. But is there any Richard Bachman stories that you...
God, I'd have to see a list of titles. I've read 3. I know for sure I've read 3, and I can't think of a single one right now. What are some titles of Bachman? I can tell you which ones I read, and then I'll remember them.
Well, I think this one that I'm looking up right now is called Rage. I think this is the one with the school shooting.
Oh, right.
Yeah, this is the one that he wanted pulled from publication.
Really?
Yeah, he said that I think it was in the wake of Sandy Hook, if I'm not mistaken. It was very disturbed by obviously what had gone on there. You know, the mass shooting of a bunch of small children. You know, if you wrote a book about a school shooting, you probably would want to, you know, have a treatise out there that would give people ideas.
Well, as you know, from my inglorious address temporarily while they were ironing that out,
yeah,
I was in the kind of place where people go for things like that. And I actually have a friend. I mean, yeah, he's still a friend. I just haven't been able to talk to him too much. But this is a guy who was like 14 or 15 and he became a school shooter.
Yeah.
This was in Santee.
Yeah.
He was one of the very early ones. His name is Charles Andrew Williams. And they described this guy and they made him sound like the devil himself, and just this horrible, hideous, heartless, evil, just powerful, destructive entity. And the camera pans down on this kid that doesn't look old enough for a bus pass.
Yeah.
And you're thinking, oh my gosh, this can't be right. Something's wrong here, you know?
Yeah.
And I, you know, I was in a lot of classes where people were seeking their own truths and finding out what they did in these prison scenarios. And, you know, he talked about being bullied all the time and just never feeling like anyone could hear him, and how he actually had a gun that day. And he told himself that he told people what he was going to do.
Yeah.
And he said, if anybody, even one person said, don't do it, he was going to not do it.
Yeah.
And no one did.
Yeah.
Even people he told, they laughed it off. Yeah, right. Go for it. Get the high score. Woohoo. I mean, they didn't take it seriously, but I mean, nobody said, hey, don't do that, man.
Yeah.
No one. Scary.
There it is. I'm not going to make the bold claim that this is probably his most, realistic story that he has.
Yeah.
But honestly, though, it is the most sort of eminently relatable event, story that he could have written, since it kind of seems, I don't want to call it sort of, like a premonition of what happens afterwards. But, ever since Columbine, there's been sort of this increase. And the only thing I think that killed school shootings for a while was the pandemic. It's the one good thing that came from it. That and the amazing traffic in LA. If I could take one thing back from the pandemic, it would be the traffic and the not school shootings happening every day.
What about the getting paid to not do anything?
I mean, that was lovely too. I'll take that too. Well, I mean, it was weird because LA Times they did this thing where we were on a work share, so we still had to go to work in person. They gave us a bunch of cloth masks and put us in like I don't know what you want to call it, like some kind of a raffle for a vaccine, if it ever got done. None of us got the vaccine at work. They just said, like, if you want to go take time off to do it, they gave us that time. But I didn't get mine until like midway spring, maybe 21, something like that. But yeah, when that happened, it was, sort of insane. But obviously.
Yeah.
But yeah, Rage is the one that he writes under Richard Bachman. And that's the only one that's, I think, been pulled from publication because of his concerns that it would like inspire a school shooter. And so I think that's kind of terrifying, but
yeah, it is.
Understandable. I mean, as a writer yourself, how would you react if somebody used your writing as a justification?
Horribly.
Yeah.
How would you ever live that down,
Yeah.
Feel like you'd think it was a tragedy that you ever even became a writer.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'd be on the same wavelength there, because I mean, obviously we want our writing to affect people. We just don't want it to affect them like that, obviously.
Right.
But yeah, a lot of his work from the 70s and the 80s published under Richard Bachman. So we have Firestarter is not that.
Oh, that's actually one of my favorites.
Yeah. What do you like about it?
Well, I think I don't know if you recall, but I actually brought up that parallel to the book that we're reading right now, Lakewood.
Yeah.
And because the people being experimented on by this group that turned out to be like a CIA front.
Yeah.
Had to sign strict agreements and non-disclosures, but also they had to swear in blood that they would not have any fraternization or dating between the test subjects, because the things they were being tested with were giving them these powers like telekinesis and mind control and things like that.
Yeah.
But two of them fell in love.
Yeah.
And they had this baby that had the power of pyrotechnics, being able to make fire with her mind. And it was actually played by Drew Barrymore when she was like 11 or something like that.
If I'm not mistaken, it's the role she did right before E.T. And so that's yeah. Without that movie, we don't get her.
Yeah.
But it's pretty fascinating. But yeah, I think that's the one I've never seen. It's Firestarter.
Oh, you gotta see it. It's so good. And
Yeah.
you know who's in it?
No.
Yeah, one of the main characters is George C. Scott.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So that should be really good.
He plays this general, and his whole goal, he sees all this power in her, and he wants to make it all come out. So his main goal is to have her hate him and have the fire that come in here like a nuclear weapon and look him in the eye when it's happening. And he thinks he's going to achieve some kind of weird immortality that way. But
yeah, my brother, he really likes it, but I've never actually seen it. And yeah, I didn't realize that was the cast, but you have to check it out at some point. The Running Man is a Richard Bachman title, which is interesting to me. I'm trying to adapt that one again. I know you may be familiar with the Schwarzenegger one, I think from the 90s.
Right.
And then Cujo is not a Bachman title.
Cujo is
that's the dog, I think.
This scar I got right here.
Yeah.
That's from a St. Bernard.
Oh, yeah?
That happened, and then Cujo came out right after. I was like, oh, no, I can't see that. It's too scary, even though I think the dog was actually a black Labrador wearing in the movie. It was a black Labrador wearing a Saint Bernard head.
Yeah,
which is pretty crazy.
Yeah, I've not seen that one yet, but I need to get around to that.
Very scary.
Yeah, I bet. Have you read his Dark Tower series?
Yeah, well, the first one.
Okay.
Yeah, it was hard for me to read because where I was living was also very dark at the time.
Yeah.
So sometimes I would read for escapism, and sometimes if something was too dark or just a little too noir, then I would go, okay, I'll read this when I get out. But right now, this is a little bit much,
Yeah.
But I did like the kind of almost samurai-like kind of culture of being passed down from gunfighters, and I did like that part of it.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by the idea of the Dark Tower, but I've actually not read anything in the series. I saw the movie from a few years back, but from what I'm told, it wasn't very good. It was with Idris Elba and Matthew McConaughey, and in principle, it should have worked with that kind of a pedigree.
Yeah,
but for whatever reason, it didn't. So that's kind of sad. But the next topic we have is Pet Cemetery.
Ah, okay.
So Pet Cemetery, you've seen it?
Yeah.
What'd you think?
Well, I thought that I heard somebody say that they tried to redo kind of a Lazarus moment, and I hope that's not true.
Yeah.
But the concept is pretty scary.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. But yeah, I think for me, like, I'm familiar with the one they did, I think, in the 90s, but I saw the one they did recently, and I thought it was fine. I know some people on the internet might crucify me for that. But from what I'm told, there also is some sort of a spin-off on Paramount Plus that I have to check out at some point.
Really?
Yeah. Apparently David Duchovny's in it, of the X-Files fame.
Yeah.
So I'm curious just on that alone, but haven't gotten around to it just yet. But the next one, what do we got?
What's your favorite
Of all
Stephen King's? Yeah,
I think I'm going to go with 11/22/63. It's the one I keep returning to the most. Although in terms of movies, I mean, they've adapted so many. Obviously, I think it depends on my mood, but I think if I'm in the mood for a really good movie, I'll probably turn on either The Shawshank Redemption or The Green Mile, since those are movies that never fail.
Yeah.
I don't know if we call those crowd pleasers, but I definitely think they are.
Yeah, for sure. What was it? The goal? I mean, the Shawshank Redemption as a script. I think the book was called Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption, right? It was a short story. I think it was like 70 pages or something. Yeah. But when the book came out, it had so many interesting things about it, and especially who the characters were. And some of the stuff that was written very seriously turned into comedy on accident. For example, the character that Morgan Freeman played, Red, was supposed to be white.
Yeah.
But the character's name was Red. And so in the line, he just says, "I'm Red," and then kind of shrugs and says, "It's because I'm Irish."
Yeah.
Which is a normal line for a white dude.
Yeah.
But when it made it with him, it actually changed the whole tenor of his character because it became comedy, and then it sort of endeared him. And so it's kind of interesting that the depth of, and also the escape, the way that happened just a little bit at a time, that took so much patience on, not just on the character's part, not on just on Andy Dufresne's part, but on Stephen King's part, to be able to even think of a plot that would have to, that's risky, right? Have a plot that literally is just little grains of sand at a time going out throughout the story and still have it work. I mean, that was masterful.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it just speaks. I mean, a lot of people, I think, in the literary world have been prone to kind of shit on him for being kind of I think they always shit on people who have like this mass market ability. Yeah. And so it's like, even though I think a lot of his stories are very, much quality, but for whatever reason, they call it the sci-fi ghetto or just the literary ghetto, where it's like, if you're going to write something in those genres, you're obviously not going to be pigeonholed as a reputable writer, because you're not writing in serious fiction. And so obviously when I met Stephen Paul Martin, the our main guy at SDSU, and I made the point that I wanted to write character driven science fiction, and I made the point that I wanted to write literary genre fiction. He kind of made a point to say that, well, no, science fiction is one of the genres that they actually take it very seriously. And I'm like, I'll take your word for it. I'm not involved in the world of academia. So, that's good to hear. So my battle that I wanted to fight is significantly diminished. So
yeah,
that's good.
Yeah, I'm not sure yet. I have always wanted to do sci-fi. I've done the closest I've come is like computer programs that kind of delve into mysticism, kind of, like a line between spiritual and digital, but I haven't gotten all the way to fantasy. But as far as what I like to read, I love to read sci-fi and fantasy. The Ender's Game series, I read like 2 times in a row, the whole series,
Yeah, that's the one thing I know I wanted to intend to buy Ender's Game, but I never got around to reading it.
Yeah.
I mean, even beyond, whatever feelings are for Orson Scott Card personally, I think you should always read the stories of anybody, even if you don't agree with the person, because the art should still stand on its own.
Fair enough.
Ultimately. But beyond that, we only have a few more minutes. But I would like to at least cover a few more of these. He has a lot of books, so we probably won't get to all of them.
Sure.
But let's see how far we can get. So, Misery.
Yes. Yeah. That back to the main weirdness, right?
Yeah.
Oh, that was maybe the scariest one in some ways. And now, even though I read the book first and then watched the movie, now when I remember the book, I'm picturing Richard Dreyfuss and I'm picturing Kathy Bates. The hobbling and the
Richard Dreyfuss
and the typewriter and the
yeah. And I think Misery, at least the movie, I mean, it's definitely Kathy Bates' best performance, at least as a terrifying person.
Yes.
The other role I like her as is Mama in Waterboy.
Oh, right.
But no, aside from that, somebody should dress up as her character for Halloween. I know people have, but I think that's an amazing costume. Did you ever watch or read Dreamcatcher?
Yes. Dreamcatcher was a trip.
Yeah.
I wondered how true, like at the time, I wondered if there was any truth to that. It made me really wonder if I've read recently, my dad got me into reading a lot more of these stories that have kind of like, American Indian police chiefs, and they have to kind of know the spirituality and the mysticism and then also the law and separate and put how much truth is there to things like capturing dreams and walking in the light between worlds. And as much as my brain is scientific, I'm also totally capable of believing the most outlandish stuff.
Well, I do think it's the mark of a wise person. I don't know about myself being wise or anything, but I think it's the mark of a wise person to entertain a thought without having to fully accept it. So I think if you're doing that, you're well on your way. But beyond that, have you read Under the Dome? That's another door stopper.
Yeah. That is huge. Interesting too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there was just the scenes like with the dome having perfectly slit like livestock in the middle.
That's a lot of great imagery.
It also makes you wonder how true the idea is that you could completely isolate just one, and then why. Trying to figure out at first, like, is it military? Is it alien? Like, what are we looking at here? What is this thing? I like it when something huge happens and you don't know why exactly.
Yeah, I tend to like that kind of stuff too, but I also like it when you never find out what the reason is.
Right.
Because I think in The Mist, he kind of plays with this idea of, I think it's called the Arrowhead Project, and they're kind of responsible for opening up this like extra dimensional hole that lets all these bizarre creatures come through and ends up killing tons of people in this main town. So, that I think he's just making a wider point about, science kind of going too far and like, you
Sure.
know, causing that. But
What do you think about that?
what?
That science, that premise is actually echoed a lot in Einstein and a lot of other things. Like one of my favorite Einstein quotes was, "I do not know what weapons we will use in the Third World War, but I know what we will use in the Fourth: rocks."
Yeah. I think the actual quote is something like, I don't know what I know what weapons we'll be fighting World War, and I'm really butchering it with, but it's going to be, but I know World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones.
Mm.
But yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about that. I mean, personally, I'm definitely a man who's 100% on like, you know, pro science. I'd rather put my faith in at least trying with the knowledge we have scientifically than trying to put it on something like faith or anything like that. I feel like for me, it's more imperative to proactively solve our problems rather than, you know, kind of hope these things away. Even though hope, I think, is definite, you know, plays a role
I think
in a
hope
lot
is
of it.
important because if you have hope, you make actions that help the outcome of a hopeful premise. So it's like if you have hope that positive things are going to happen, you will take steps as if that thing has already happened. That's what's good about faith. You can be a scientist and not believe in anything supernatural, but if you believe something should happen and you want it to, then you take the necessary steps to meet that eventuality halfway. You know, you're
Yeah.
already partway there.
Yeah, I think that kind of covers what we were talking about in class today. But yeah, I think even beyond that, I think sort of the thing for me is part of science is to admit what we don't know, as well as question things we, you know, want to find answers to. So I've never believed that science can be like a belief system. I know there's some people who seem to think that it's sort of a replacement for religion, and I think that's a wacky point of view. So I never believed in this concept of scientism or whatever, the belief that science has now become some sort of religion. And
I think that's inside out. I think that if God is real, I mean this in a, you know, I believe he is, but if God is real, then he has to have used science to do everything he did. I mean, an all-knowing God would just be the greatest scientist ever because it was things don't just happen with magic fairy dust just because somebody has a title God. There still have to, you know, when the earth is formless and void, and you have to look at like what these swirling mists were, and if you really get into it, like a lot of the things like Jacob's ladder could be a wormhole, or on earth as it is in heaven could be parallel universes.
yeah,
They say light is really a vibration from the fifth dimension, and then you look at the light of the world, and like you can really tie science and old religions together very closely as not being opposites but just different interpretations of the same stuff, you know.
well, I mean, not a Stephen King thing, but Carl Sagan's Cosmos, I think, is trying to
Right.
sort of explore this theme of, you know, can science and religion sort of coexist? And I think oftentimes, I think they can. They would just have to serve different uh, outputs and different, you know, points of view. And so, generally speaking, I think, you know, as somebody who does not partake in the belief in any deities or supernatural elements, I mean, I have plenty of friends who, you know, do. I mean, I've friends from pretty much every religion,
Sure.
and as long as they're not trying to push their stuff on me, I mean, they can bring up a point and, you know, kind of open my view to something, and that's perfectly fine. I'm okay with that. But, you know, generally speaking,
That's what I was going to say. Don't
yeah,
you push your protractors and microscopes on me, Mr. Science
yeah,
Guy.
yeah, there you go.
I'm trying to be a man.
No, Mr. Science Guy is a completely different man. His name's Bill. My scenario is a lot different. But yeah. Well, we're about to our hour. Kind of went by a little bit quicker than I thought. Don't know about you, but
That's good.
yeah, no, this is very good you know, to have you here. Thank you for being a guest on the show. I would like to invite you on again at some point, hopefully soon.
Thank you for inviting me to the Digital Humanities Dungeon.
Yes.
Dun, dun, dun,
And we have to definitely thank our San Diego State University Digital Humanities Department for letting us take a few moments to record our video here.
And if you'd like to hear much less facts, but with just as much humor, I forgot to give my own self a plug. You can also hear the Ben Free podcast on Audible and Apple and Spotify and all that.
And we'll be sure to put all of the information you want to reach out to Ben in the description below.
Except for his phone number, because his phone rings too much already.
Well, within reason, I will say.
Ben Free Project is on every stuff.
Yeah.
It's on all the socials and everything. So,
yep. So definitely reach out to him. View his podcast, view anything that you find interesting, and definitely reach out to Ben. He's very, very welcome here, and he's definitely a really good friend. So, aside from that, we'll sign off for a minute with a couple little things. So, next week we'll be covering my story Cherryfield, and be sure to tune in that episode if it strikes your interest. And with that, remember, folks, don't panic, as well as don't forget your towel. And until next time, I've been the Phill, and this has been Scuttlebutt with the Phill. And with that, so long, and thanks for all the fish.